Every year, millions of people pour a simple red liquid over their food, completely unaware they are consuming the product of one of the most ruthless financial recoveries in American history. This is not a quaint tale of a Southern gentleman tinkering in his kitchen. This is a cold, calculated business success story born out of absolute economic devastation. The man behind the bottle was utterly ruined, bankrupt, driven from his home by an invading army. Yet, from the ashes of a collapsed banking empire, Edmund McIlhenny engineered a global monopoly. The Tabasco sauce history is written in blood, salt, and ruthless opportunism. Today, the McIlhenny Company controls a heavily guarded, fiercely private billion-dollar dynasty. A dynasty built on a product that costs pennies to make, but commands premium prices worldwide. Tabasco sauce is not just a condiment, it is a masterclass in market domination. But the true foundation of this empire was not the peppers, and it was not the recipe. The real reason this dynasty survived a century of aggressive corporate warfare was hidden in a bizarre, almost invisible legal maneuver involving a piece of discarded glass. A maneuver so cunning, it locked out competitors for generations. We will reveal exactly how that trap was set later. Right now, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when the founder of this empire was nothing more than a desperate, broken banker standing in the ruins of a burning world. Before the red sauce, there was money. A lot of it. In the 1850s, Edmund McIlhenny was not a farmer. He was not a chef. He was an apex predator in the financial ecosystem of New Orleans. He was an independent banker, a man who understood leverage, risk, and the ruthless extraction of capital. New Orleans was the richest city in the South, a booming, sweating metropolis built on cotton, sugar, and human labor. Millions of dollars flowed through its ports every single day. McIlhenny sat right at the center of this golden river. He discounted banknotes. He traded commercial paper. He financed the massive agricultural operations that drove the local economy. He secured the shipping routes. He collected staggering interest rates. He was wealthy. He was untouchable. He married into the Avery family, a clan of immense political and economic influence who owned a massive geographical anomaly called Avery Island. Avery Island was not just land, it was a geological freak of nature, a mountain of pure, solid salt rising out of the Louisiana marsh, extending miles into the earth. It was a natural vault of limitless wealth. Life for the McIlhenny and Avery families was an endless parade of luxury. Wealth compounding upon wealth. They built grand estates. They imported European luxuries. But financial gravity is absolute, and in 1861, gravity arrived wrapped in artillery fire. The American Civil War did not just disrupt the Southern economy, it vaporized it entirely. The Confederate currency gradually became worthless paper. Plantations were burned to the ground. Shipping lanes were blockaded by federal gunboats. The intricate web of debt and credit that McIlhenny had spent years building collapsed into dust. When Union forces captured New Orleans in 1862, the banking industry was severely disrupted. McIlhenny lost his bank. He lost his cash reserves. He lost his entire identity as a master of capital. He fled with his family to Avery Island, hoping the isolated salt dome would provide a sanctuary from the collapsing world. It did not. The Union Army quickly learned of the massive salt mines on the island. Salt was a critical strategic military asset. It preserved meat. It kept armies marching. It cured leather for saddles and boots. The Union forces launched a massive, targeted assault. They overran the island. They burned the mining infrastructure to the ground. They neutralized the massive salt reserves. McIlhenny was forced to run again, a refugee in his own state, penniless, hunted, stripped of every single asset he had ever owned. For 3 brutal years, the former millionaire lived in exile in Texas. He watched from afar as the world he once owned burned to ash. When the war finally ended in 1865, he returned to Louisiana. The devastation was absolute. The South was a post-apocalyptic wasteland of shattered infrastructure and starving populations. The Avery plantation was a total ruin. The grand sugar fields were overgrown with weeds. The salt mines were flooded and destroyed. The bank was gone. The money was gone. At over 50 years old, an age where most men of his former stature were preparing for a comfortable retirement, Edmund McIlhenny was entirely destitute. But a banker's mind does not stop calculating simply because the vault is empty. McIlhenny looked at the ruined agricultural landscape. He saw a traumatized population surviving on a diet of absolute misery. The post-war Southern diet was remarkably bland. Cornmeal, beans, scraps of salted meat. Flavor was a luxury that no one could afford, yet everyone desperately craved. Before the war, a traveler had given McIlhenny a handful of seeds from a fiery pepper native to the Mexican state of Tabasco. He had planted them on Avery Island purely for amusement, a wealthy man's garden curiosity. When he returned to the ruined island, he found a miracle. The delicate sugarcane had died, the elaborate botanical gardens were destroyed, but the peppers had survived. They had thrived in the harsh, humid Louisiana heat. They were bright red, fiercely hot, and growing like weeds in the ashes of his former life. He did not see a garden. He saw a highly scalable commodity. He understood supply and demand better than anyone. The demand for flavor in a bleak post-war world was infinite. The supply was precisely zero. He had the only viable crop of these specific peppers in the entire region. But fresh peppers rot. They cannot be shipped. They cannot be stored in warehouses. A raw commodity is only valuable if it can be scaled, packaged, and transported across state lines. He needed a way to stabilize the volatile asset. He began mashing the bright red peppers with the only resource he had left in abundance, the massive reserves of raw salt mined directly from Avery Island. He let the fiery mash ferment in discarded wooden barrels. He let the harsh chemical reaction take its course. For weeks, the mixture bubbled and aged, transforming from a rapidly decaying agricultural product into a highly concentrated, shelf-stable liquid asset. He then cut the fermented mash with strong French white wine vinegar to halt the fermentation process and lock in the aggressive flavor profile. The result was a potent, fiery red liquid. It was incredibly cheap to produce. It required almost zero labor overhead. And it possessed an incredibly long shelf life. It was the absolute perfect industrial product. But a product is entirely useless without packaging. And in 1868, glass bottles were prohibitively expensive. McIlhenny had absolutely no capital to buy custom glassware. So he scavenged. He sourced hundreds of discarded, empty cologne bottles. Small, thick glass vials originally designed for luxury perfumes. He cleaned them out, filled them with his aggressive red liquid, and sealed them with green wax. The packaging was a pure accident of poverty, but it inadvertently created a massive psychological advantage. It created an aura of high-end exclusivity. It looked like a rare, imported medicinal tonic. It looked valuable. He packed 350 of these repurposed cologne bottles into wooden crates and sent them to a powerful network of wholesale grocers he still knew from his lucrative banking days. He bypassed the local consumer markets entirely. He aimed straight for the major distributors who controlled the flow of goods into the wealthy urban centers. He priced the small bottles at an astronomical premium, $1 per bottle. In 1868, $1 was a massive, almost offensive sum for a simple condiment. It is the modern equivalent of charging $25 for a 2-ounce bottle of pepper water. It was a brutal, arrogant price point, but it was a highly calculated risk. He was testing the market elasticity. He was betting that the sheer intensity of the product, combined with the perceived luxury of the heavy cologne bottle, would override the extreme cost. The response was instantaneous, and it was explosive. The grocers demanded more. The wealthy patrons in New York and New Orleans became hopelessly addicted to the intense heat. The first commercial batch sold out immediately. The ruined banker had found his new currency. He had tapped into a physiological addiction. He had commodified pain and flavor, bottling it at a massive, unprecedented profit margin. The foundation of a new global empire was poured. But scaling a local novelty into a national monopoly requires more than just a good product. It requires the systematic, ruthless elimination of all who dare to copy you. And Edmund McIlhenny was about to show the entire food industry exactly how a Wall Street financier protects his investments. Edmund McIlhenny was financially dead. The year was 1865. The American Civil War had just ended. His lucrative banking career was entirely reduced to ash. His vast reserves of Confederate currency were worth less than the mud on his boots. He was a refugee in his own country, forced to flee to Avery Island, a massive, isolated salt dome surrounded by the unforgiving Louisiana swamps. He had absolutely nothing. No capital, no leverage, no foreseeable future. But bankers do not stop being bankers simply because the bank burns to the ground. The financial mindset is a permanent affliction. They constantly adapt. They survey the wreckage of their lives. They ruthlessly look for new assets to exploit. His only remaining asset was a small patch of Capsicum frutescens, Mexican peppers, given to him by a mysterious traveler years before the war. They had grown wild while he was away in exile, a vibrant crimson anomaly against the bleak, devastated post-war landscape. McIlhenny did not look at those plants and see a garden. He saw a factory floor. He saw an unexploited resource. He began harvesting and mashing the peppers. He mixed them with the natural rock salt mined directly from beneath Avery Island. He packed the fiery red mash into wooden barrels. He let it ferment. He let the natural acids break down the pulp. This was not a culinary experiment born out of a passion for Southern cooking. This was a calculated manufacturing process. A desperate man engineering a consumable product with an incredibly long shelf life. More importantly, it was a massive test of psychological endurance. The mash had to age. It required patience. A ruined man with zero income had to wait months, eventually expanding the process to lock up his capital for 3 full years in oak barrels. He was essentially aging risk. By 1868, he was finally ready to test the market. He produced his very first commercial batch, exactly 658 bottles. But he immediately faced a massive logistical hurdle. Glassware was incredibly expensive. Supply chains in the reconstructed South were entirely non-existent. A normal entrepreneur would have paused production. McIlhenny simply scavenged. He acquired discarded cologne bottles from a local supplier. This desperate, cost-saving measure resulted in one of the greatest accidental marketing triumphs in corporate history. The cologne bottles featured a built-in sprinkler fitment, a tiny opening designed to dispense expensive perfume drop by drop. When repurposed for his highly concentrated, fermented pepper mash, it created a brilliant piece of psychological user experience design. You could not simply pour this liquid over your meal. You had to dash it, drop by agonizing drop. It forced the consumer to interact with the product cautiously. It made the sauce feel incredibly potent, dangerous, precious, like liquid gold in a glass vault. Then came the pricing strategy. This is where the cold, calculating mind of the former financier truly revealed itself to the world. McIlhenny did not price his concoction like a cheap, everyday table condiment. He priced it like an exclusive, untouchable luxury import. He charged $1 per bottle. In 1868, $1 was the equivalent of a full day of grueling labor for the average American worker. It was an exorbitant, almost insulting price tag. He was effectively selling spicy vinegar for the price of fine French wine. And the strategy worked flawlessly. High pricing created an immediate aura of elite exclusivity. The wealthy elite of New Orleans bought the narrative. It became an instant status symbol on the dining tables of high society. If you could afford this tiny bottle of red fire, you had money to burn. He quickly secured wholesale distribution deals, first conquering Louisiana, then expanding his reach to the lucrative, fast-paced markets of New York. He partnered with powerful distributors who recognized the addictive nature of the product. By 1870, he secured a federal patent, United States Patent number 97,047. The patent was the first brick in the massive wall of his new monopoly. It protected his highly specific method of preparing the pepper mash. But McIlhenny, the banker, knew that a process patent was never enough. Patents expire. Methods can be slightly altered. Brands, however, are immortal. He needed a permanent, legally binding name. He chose Tabasco, a word of Mexican Indian origin, roughly translating to a place where the soil is humid. As soon as the serious money began to flow, the corporate vultures began to circle. The late 19th century was a dark, lawless era of American capitalism. If you built something highly profitable, a dozen ruthless copycats would immediately try to steal your market share. By the 1880s, the condiment market was suddenly flooded with cheap counterfeits, fraudulent red sauces, packaged in identical scavenged Cologne bottles, bearing names explicitly designed to confuse the uneducated consumer. Rival companies practically cloned his entire operation overnight. McIlhenny did not just try to compete with these rivals on store shelves. He went to absolute war. He unleashed a relentless, highly funded wave of cease and desist orders. He dragged competing sauce manufacturers into federal courts across the country. He claimed absolute, exclusive legal rights to the word Tabasco. This was a massive, unprecedented legal gamble at the time. Under traditional trademark law, you cannot claim exclusive ownership of a geographic location. Tabasco was a widely recognized state in Mexico. The pepper itself was a known botanical variety. But McIlhenny and his ruthless legal team argued something entirely revolutionary. They introduced the concept of secondary meaning. They argued that to the American consumer, the word Tabasco did not mean a state in Mexico. It did not mean a type of wild plant. It meant his specific sauce. It meant his personal brand. He weaponized the federal legal system to construct an impenetrable moat around his empire. He bled his undercapitalized rivals dry through endless, agonizing, expensive litigation. He completely crushed local Louisiana copycats. He forced competing manufacturers into total bankruptcy. He even sued the distributors and grocery stores who dared to stock counterfeit bottles on their shelves. He essentially privatized a word. He stole a geographical name from the map and violently transformed it into his own personal intellectual property. This legal brutality transformed a simple agricultural byproduct into a legally protected, incredibly high-margin, monopolistic asset. The profit margins were absolutely staggering. Avery Island provided the salt for free. The earth provided the peppers for mere pennies. The manufacturing overhead costs were minimal, yet the retail price remained astronomically high. Edmund McIlhenny was no longer a ruined, displaced banker begging for scraps. He was the undisputed king of a rapidly expanding, highly lucrative condiment empire. He was printing money, generating millions of dollars in modern purchasing power from a simple, spicy red mash. His distribution network soon crossed oceans, reaching the elite dining tables of European aristocrats and foreign dignitaries. He had successfully turned a total financial catastrophe into a global corporate dynasty. He built an unassailable, legally fortified fortress around his red liquid. But a fortress is only as strong as the people guarding the gates. And as the 19th century drew to a close, McIlhenny would learn a terrifying, unavoidable lesson about wealth. The real threat to his billion-dollar dynasty was not a rival sauce maker. It was not a hostile corporate takeover from a northern syndicate. The true danger was much closer to home. It was hiding in his own bloodline. Avery Island was no longer just a refuge. It was a sovereign state, a fortress of absolute, unadulterated wealth. Edmund McIlhenny, the banker who had lost everything to the fires of the Civil War, had done more than just rebuild. He had engineered a financial anomaly. He had turned a humid, mosquito-infested salt dome into one of the most profitable private fiefdoms in American history. The math behind his empire was almost offensive in its simplicity. The raw materials cost next to nothing. The peppers grew aggressively in the Louisiana dirt. The salt was mined directly from the earth beneath their boots. The vinegar was a cheap commodity. Time was the only real investment. The mash sat in oak barrels for years, fermenting, aging, growing more valuable by the day. The most expensive part of the operation was the glass bottle, and even that was a masterclass in psychological pricing. By packaging his fiery concoction in small, discarded Cologne bottles, Edmund created an illusion. He anchored the product not alongside cheap farm goods, but alongside luxury imports. It was a 2-ounce vessel of liquid gold. Consumers did not pour it. They dashed it, drop by drop. This artificial scarcity, combined with the elegant packaging, allowed McIlhenny to charge exorbitant premiums. The profit margins were astronomical. They defied the standard economic models of the late 19th century. Industrialists in the North were spending millions of dollars on steel mills, coal mines, and thousands of laborers just to scrape by on single-digit margins. Edmund was yielding margins that would make a modern software company jealous, all from rotting peppers and salt. By the 1880s, the money was no longer trickling in. It was a flood. The McIlhenny family transformed from desperate survivors of a collapsed Southern economy into deep-pocketed aristocrats. They did not just participate in high society, they dictated it. The family integrated seamlessly into the elite circles of New Orleans. They dined in the finest restaurants. They occupied premium boxes at the opera. They draped themselves in imported European silks. But unlike the old plantation families, who were slowly suffocating under the weight of their own debt and crumbling estates, the McIlhennys were flush with liquid cash. They owed nothing to the banks. They were the bank. Avery Island evolved into a self-sustaining, closed-loop economy. It was the ultimate capitalist utopia. The family owned the land, they owned the salt mines below the surface, they owned the pepper fields above, and they owned the people, at least economically. Generations of workers lived on the island. They were born in the McIlhenny Hospital. They lived in houses built by the McIlhenny Company. They bought their groceries at the McIlhenny Company store. The wealth circulated, but it never left the island. It just moved from the workers' pockets back into the family vault. It was a modern feudal system, wrapped in the scent of fermented spice. When Edmund McIlhenny passed away in 1890, he did not leave behind a mere hot sauce business. He left behind a global dynasty. His sons, John and Edward, inherited a machine that printed money, and they knew exactly how to spend it. They escalated the gilded lifestyle to absurd new heights. Edward, known to the locals as Mr. Ned, decided that a simple agricultural estate was not enough. He wanted a paradise. He used the endless river of pepper cash to transform Avery Island into a sprawling, exotic botanical garden. He imported thousands of rare plants from across the globe, bamboo forests from China, exotic flowers from South America. He even built a massive sanctuary to breed snowy egrets, saving the birds from extinction, purely because he enjoyed looking at them. This was not conservation. This was a flex of absolute financial supremacy. It was the kind of spending that only happens when money loses its meaning, when a family realizes that their revenue stream is entirely divorced from their labor. The McIlhennys did not have to work. The barrels worked for them. The brand became a staple in the highest courts of the world. Queen Victoria's royal household demanded regular shipments. The British Parliament kept it stocked in their dining rooms. The product was ubiquitous, but the family remained completely isolated in their Louisiana fortress. They built opulent mansions on the island, hidden away from the prying eyes of the public and the tax collectors. They lived like exiled royalty. Their isolation bred a specific type of arrogance. They believed their position was unassailable. They had cornered the market on a flavor that the world had suddenly decided it could not live without. They controlled the supply. They dictated the price. They owned the name. Tabasco was no longer just a sauce. It was a noun, a verb, a cultural default, and the family reaped every single penny of that cultural dominance. They amassed a fortune that rivaled the great titans of industry, yet they did it entirely under the radar. No Wall Street analysts scrutinized their quarterly earnings. No activist investors demanded board seats. They answered to no one. They had perfectly insulated themselves from the chaos of the outside world. The ruined banker had built an impenetrable castle of glass bottles and oak barrels. It seemed like the perfect crime. A monopoly so niche, so bizarre, that no one could possibly dismantle it. But isolation has a fatal flaw. It blinds you to the enemies gathering at the gates. And while the McIlhenny heirs were busy wandering through their imported bamboo forests and counting their infinite cash, a brutal legal war was quietly brewing. A war that threatened to strip the family of the one specific word that gave them all their power. Every monopoly has an expiration date. Edmund McIlhenny had spent 2 decades turning a worthless weed into liquid gold. He had cornered the market. He had built an unassailable fortress on Avery Island. But fortresses are rarely breached from the outside. They rot from within. In 1890, the patriarch died. He left behind a global empire, a staggering fortune, and a fatal structural flaw. The McIlhenny Company was not a modern corporation. It was a feudal fiefdom, and feudal fiefdoms always suffer when the king dies. Power transferred to his eldest son, John Avery McIlhenny. John did not have his father's quiet, desperate hunger. John was born into immense wealth. He wanted glory. Running a condiment factory was entirely beneath him. He expanded production, yes. He pushed the family product into European markets. But his eyes were firmly fixed on Washington, on high society, on historical legacy. This lack of singular focus was the first major crack in the foundation. While John was busy playing the aristocrat, the corporate vultures began to circle. Capitalism abhors a vacuum, but it absolutely despises a 90% profit margin. The sheer scale of the McIlhenny wealth had become an open secret across the American South. Rival merchants looked at the iconic Cologne bottles. They looked at the fiery red liquid. They realized the barrier to entry was practically zero. Salt, vinegar, peppers, time. That was the entire formula. Anyone could make it. But nobody could sell it like the McIlhenny family. So the competitors decided not to beat the product. They decided to steal the entire identity. This is where the genius of Edmund McIlhenny ran headfirst into the brutal reality of American corporate law. Edmund had named his sauce after the Mexican state of Tabasco. He thought it sounded exotic. He thought it sounded exclusive. He was dead wrong. Under the trademark laws of the late 19th century, geographical names were strictly public domain. You could not own the word Paris. You could not own the word London. And according to the federal courts, you could not own the word Tabasco. The floodgates opened. It was a corporate bloodbath. By 1898, the market was drowning in cheap counterfeits. Dozens of rival companies sprang up overnight. B.F. Trappy, a former McIlhenny employee, launched his own identical brand. He used the exact same peppers. He used the exact same aging process. He even used the exact same style of bottle, and he called it Tabasco. He was not alone. Over 40 different companies began selling Tabasco sauce. They undercut the McIlhenny price by 50%, then by 70%. The empire began to hemorrhage cash at a terrifying rate. Sales plummeted. The McIlhenny family was no longer selling a monopoly. They were selling a highly competitive commodity. And in the ruthless world of commodities, the lowest price always wins out. The family fortune was being siphoned away by aggressive copycats. Millions of dollars in modern equivalent value simply evaporated from the balance sheets. The brand equity was being systematically destroyed. Restaurants would buy one authentic McIlhenny bottle, empty it, and then endlessly refill it with cheap, watered-down imitations. The consumer could not tell the difference. The pristine reputation of Avery Island was rotting in the gutters of cheap diners. Faced with the greatest financial crisis in the history of the company, John Avery McIlhenny made a staggering decision. He quit. In 1898, at the absolute height of the counterfeit wars, John walked away from the family empire. He joined Theodore Roosevelt and the famously rugged Rough Riders. He traded the bloody boardroom for the actual battlefield. He left the bleeding, vulnerable company entirely in the hands of his younger brother, Edward Avery McIlhenny. Edward was a naturalist, an explorer. He had spent years traversing the freezing Arctic. He had zero interest in corporate warfare, but he had absolutely no choice. The family dynasty was hours away from total collapse. The bank accounts were draining fast. The legal bills were becoming astronomical. Edward returned to Avery Island and found a company under total siege. He realized immediately that fighting a massive price war was corporate suicide. You cannot outcompete 40 imitators on price without completely destroying the underlying product. He needed a different weapon. He needed the United States government. Edward launched one of the most aggressive, scorched earth legal campaigns in American commercial history. He did not sue for patent infringement. The original patent had already expired. He sued for trademark protection under a brand new piece of federal legislation, the Trademark Act of 1905. This specific law contained a highly technical, easily overlooked clause. It was known in legal circles as the 10-year proviso. It stated that if a company had exclusive use of a geographical name for exactly 10 years prior to the passage of the act, they could legally claim it as a federal trademark. Edward weaponized this obscure clause. He hired the most ruthless corporate attorneys money could buy. He dragged every single competitor into federal court. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on endless litigation, a staggering sum of capital for the era. The strategy was brutally simple: bleed the copycats dry. Most of the rival companies were small, underfunded operations. They could not afford to fight a protracted legal battle against the deep pockets of the McIlhenny estate. Edward buried them in endless paperwork. He filed injunction after injunction. But B.F. Trappy absolutely refused to die. Trappy fought back with vicious, unrelenting intensity. He argued that the McIlhenny family had never actually had exclusive use of the name. The legal battles dragged on for years, then decades. The local courtrooms of Louisiana became bitter war zones. Prominent families were torn apart. Decades-long friendships were completely destroyed. The local economy fractured sharply along company lines. You were either a fiercely loyal McIlhenny man or a Trappy man. Edward poured millions of dollars of family wealth into the legal furnace just to protect a single pivotal word. Eventually, the Supreme Courts ruled. The massive gamble paid off. The McIlhenny family won the exclusive federal right to the word Tabasco. They relentlessly crushed the remaining imitators. They forced Trappy to completely change his labels. They violently regained the monopoly. But the victory was incredibly costly. The sheer volume of capital burned in the legal fires permanently altered the financial trajectory of the entire estate. They had temporarily saved the brand, but they had exposed a terrifying vulnerability. The entire global empire rested on the fragile interpretation of a single federal law. Edward had successfully defended the fortress from the outside world, but he was completely blind to the silent, devastating trap his own father had left buried deep within the family trust. By 1890, the creator of the world's most famous condiment was dead. Edmund McIlhenny breathed his last, leaving behind a moderately successful local enterprise and a sprawling, humid estate. He did not leave behind a billion-dollar dynasty. He left behind a fragile, highly vulnerable target. The moment his heart stopped, the sharks began to circle. The hot sauce market in the late 19th century was completely unregulated. It was a chaotic frontier of counterfeiters, opportunists, and intellectual property thieves. Edmund had proven that people would pay a premium for liquid fire. Now, everyone wanted a piece of the margins. Competitors sprang up across Louisiana like weeds. They bottled cheap, unaged pepper mash, slapped a red label on it, and called it Tabasco. They undercut the McIlhenny price. They flooded grocery shelves. They diluted the brand into obscurity. This is the exact moment most family businesses die. The founder perishes. The heirs panic. The market cannibalizes the product. Edmund left the operation to his eldest son, John Avery McIlhenny. John was not a banker like his father. He was a ruthless pragmatist. He was a man who would later ride into combat with Theodore Roosevelt. He understood aggression. He looked at the family ledger and saw bleeding margins. The copycats were suffocating them. They were stealing the name. They were stealing the aesthetic. John realized a cold, hard truth of capitalism. A great product is worthless without a moat. John needed a weapon. He needed a legal bludgeon to eliminate the imposters. And he found it in the most unlikely place. Remember that discarded piece of trash from the New Orleans alleyway mentioned at the very beginning? The open loop is now closed. When Edmund first started mixing his pepper mash, he was entirely broke. He could not afford custom glass packaging. He salvaged discarded Cologne bottles to house his first commercial batches. These bottles had a very specific, narrow neck. They featured a unique sprinkler fitment designed to dispense perfume one drop at a time. Edmund used them out of pure, desperate necessity. John Avery McIlhenny looked at that Cologne bottle and saw a legal fortress. He realized you cannot patent a recipe for mashed peppers and vinegar. The ingredients are too basic. Any competent chemist could reverse engineer the flavor profile in an afternoon. But you can trademark a visual identity. You can monopolize a shape. John mobilized a brutal legal campaign. He did not sue competitors for stealing the recipe. He sued them for stealing the bottle. He argued that the distinct shape of the repurposed Cologne bottle, combined with the diamond logo and the green neckband, constituted proprietary trade dress. It was a masterstroke of corporate aggression. John dragged his rivals into court. He weaponized the legal system to bleed them dry. Small independent sauce makers could not afford the crushing attorney fees. McIlhenny buried them in paperwork. He forced them into bankruptcy or forced them to change their packaging. Once a competitor was forced to put their sauce in a standard wide-mouth jar, the consumer illusion was shattered. Without the iconic Cologne bottle shape, the copycat sauces looked like exactly what they were: cheap imitations. Sales of the counterfeiters plummeted. But John did not stop at the glass. He went after the very word itself. Tabasco is a region in Mexico. Under standard trademark law, you cannot claim exclusive rights to a geographical location. You cannot trademark the word Paris to sell water, and you should not be able to trademark a Mexican state to sell sauce. Competitors argued that Tabasco simply described the type of pepper used. It was a generic agricultural term. John Avery McIlhenny refused to accept this limitation. He launched a decades-long lobbying and legal siege to claim total ownership of the word. He introduced a ruthless legal concept known as secondary meaning. He argued that his father had used the word so extensively and for so long that it had acquired a new definition. In the minds of the American consumer, Tabasco no longer meant a humid swamp in southern Mexico. It meant the McIlhenny family's specific liquid gold. The legal battle was vicious. Rival firms fought back with immense ferocity. They grew the exact same peppers. They aged them in the exact same region of Louisiana. They called their product Tabasco. John and his brother Edward Avery McIlhenny spent vast fortunes on lawyers. They effectively purchased a monopoly through the courts. They secured a bizarre, almost unprecedented federal trademark on a geographic name. The courts ruled in favor of the McIlhenny dynasty. Competitors were legally barred from using the word Tabasco on their bottles. The rivals simply folded. It was a flawlessly executed corporate slaughter. The brothers transformed their father's accidental invention into an unassailable intellectual property fortress. They had successfully privatized a word in the English dictionary. This legal moat allowed them to dictate market terms. With no direct competitors allowed to use the iconic name or the familiar Cologne bottle shape, the McIlhenny family commanded absolute pricing power. If a restaurant wanted to offer the premium sauce their patrons demanded, they had to pay the McIlhenny toll. The margins exploded. A bottle of vinegar, salt, and peppers cost pennies to produce. The aging process required time, but time was free on their sprawling island estate. They sold the finished product for premium dollars. The spread between the cost of goods sold and the retail price was staggering. It was a cash printing machine disguised as a condiment factory. Profits flowed back into the island. The family expanded their land holdings. They bought up surrounding salt domes. And then they discovered what lay beneath the pepper fields. Avery Island was sitting on top of massive oil and gas reserves. The family leased the drilling rights, generating millions of dollars in pure, unadulterated royalties. The destroyed banker's desperate side hustle had mutated into a multi-generational sovereign wealth fund. The oil money provided an infinite war chest. Absolute power breeds absolute paranoia. The brothers knew the trademark was only as strong as their willingness to defend it. They established a permanent legal strike force. A massive percentage of their immense yearly revenue was diverted into a dedicated defense fund. They hired armies of corporate lawyers to scour the globe. If a diner in Tokyo or a pub in London dared to use the word Tabasco on a menu without serving the authentic McIlhenny product, a cease and desist letter arrived within days. They employed undercover operatives to visit restaurants and test the sauce. If a waiter refilled a genuine McIlhenny bottle with cheap knockoff sauce, the family sued the restaurant into oblivion. They became the cartel bosses of the condiment aisle. They operated with the cold, calculating efficiency of a Gilded Age railroad trust. Every drop of sauce dispensed from that narrow neck was a testament to their legal supremacy. The destroyed banker had given them the seed, but his sons had built the fortress. They turned a ruined man's recipe into an asset class. They secured a legacy that would outlive them by a century. Yet, as the millions piled up and the island estate transformed into an impenetrable compound, the sheer weight of maintaining this monopoly began to warp the family dynamic. The obsession with control seeped from the boardroom into the dining room. The fortress they built to keep competitors out was now locking them in. The real cost of protecting the empire was about to be exacted on the very bloodline that built it. Edmund McIlhenny went to his grave in 1890 a deeply conflicted man. He took his final breath believing his life was a tragic failure. He was a banker, a man of high finance, a master of ledgers and loans. His true empire had been reduced to ashes by the collapse of the Southern economy. He viewed his pepper sauce as a temporary fix, a humiliating side hustle designed to keep his family fed while he waited for the real banking economy to recover. He never lived to see the ultimate irony. The banking economy did recover, but his temporary fix outlasted it all. The banker was dead, but the sauce was immortal. Today, the McIlhenny Company is an impenetrable financial fortress. It operates on a corporate model that modern Wall Street absolutely despises. It is entirely privately held. There is no venture capital. There is no private equity. There are no hostile board takeovers. The family owns 100% of the equity. They sit on a closely guarded corporate throne. Over a century later, they still control every single drop of Tabasco produced on Earth. Avery Island is not just a factory. It is a sovereign corporate fiefdom. The family extracts millions of dollars in dividends annually. They do not report to shareholders. They do not care about quarterly earnings calls. They only care about the pepper harvest. Where did all the money go? It stayed on the island. The McIlhennys weaponized patience. While other Gilded Age family dynasties diluted their shares to buy Manhattan penthouses and European titles, the heirs of Avery Island reinvested in the soil. They locked their wealth behind a ruthless trust structure. You cannot buy a share of Tabasco. You cannot short it on the open market. You cannot acquire it through a leveraged buyout. Multinational food conglomerates have tried. Giants of the industry have circled the island for decades. They arrive with briefcases full of cash. They offer billions of dollars. The family simply points them to the exit. They understand a fundamental rule of old money. Once you sell the equity, you are just a wealthy employee. If you keep the equity, you are a king. The autopsy of this empire reveals a masterclass in high-margin economics. Look at the product itself. The recipe has not changed since 1868. Vinegar, salt, peppers, thyme. That is the entire formula. The raw materials cost absolute pennies, but the brand equity is priceless. They sell over 164 million bottles a year. They ship to over 195 countries. They translate their packaging into 36 languages. Yet every single bottle is still manufactured on that same tiny patch of Louisiana salt dome. The logistics are terrifyingly efficient. The profit margins are a closely guarded family secret, but industry analysts estimate them to be astronomical. It is a license to print money, and it is entirely legal. When Edmund died, the empire was still fragile. It was his sons who weaponized the brand for global dominance. John Avery McIlhenny understood that a monopoly requires aggressive expansion. He quit the family business temporarily to join Theodore Roosevelt and the military campaigns of the era. But he did not just bring his rifle, he brought the sauce. He introduced the fiery liquid to a captive audience of soldiers. This was an accidental stroke of marketing genius. When the conflicts ended, those soldiers returned to every corner of the United States. They brought their culinary addiction with them. The military became the ultimate free distribution network. Today, the sauce is a staple in military rations worldwide. The armed forces literally subsidize the McIlhenny marketing budget. The genius of the modern operation lies in its simplicity. Edmund created an asset class far superior to fiat currency. Paper money burns, banks collapse, governments fall. But flavor addiction is permanent. The capsaicin hook ensures repeat customers. The proprietary aging process in white oak barrels creates an economic moat that competitors cannot easily cross. It takes 3 years to age the mash. Capitalists hate waiting 3 years for a return on investment. This inherent delay acts as a natural barrier to entry. Rivals cannot simply spin up a factory and replicate the depth of flavor. They are locked out by the sheer mechanics of time. Consider the scale of their physical assets. Avery Island is a geological anomaly. It is a massive pillar of solid salt rising from the Louisiana swamps. The family does not just own the sauce, they own the land. They own the salt mine beneath it. During moments of economic crisis, they leased the salt rights to generate cash flow. They diversified their holdings without ever diluting their core asset. They built a self-sustaining ecosystem. The mash is stored in repurposed bourbon barrels. The salt is mined directly beneath their feet. The peppers are grown from seeds heavily guarded under lock and key. It is a vertical integration model that would make industrial barons weep with envy. They control the supply chain from the dirt to the dining table. The legacy of the ruined banker proves the power of a desperate pivot. Edmund lost his bank. He lost his cash reserves. He lost his social standing. The war stripped him of everything he thought mattered. But in his absolute desperation, he was forced into a corner. He had nothing left to lose. So he bottled the only thing he had left. He bottled the heat of the earth. He bottled survival. His descendants now reign over a spicy empire, laughing at the ghosts of the bankers who once denied Edmund credit. They sit on a salt dome that doubles as a printing press. This is the ultimate paradox of the McIlhenny dynasty. The founder hated the product. He wanted to be a financier. He wanted to sit in boardrooms and dictate monetary policy. Instead, he ended up covered in pepper mash and vinegar. Yet his accidental creation achieved exactly what he always wanted. It created generational wealth. It built an unassailable monopoly. It secured his family name in the annals of global commerce. He used the exact same principles of leverage and monopoly building that he learned in the banking sector. He simply applied them to condiments. He cornered the market on a specific type of pain, and the world gladly paid him for it. Wealth is not just about accumulation. It is about survival. The greatest empires are not built on pristine spreadsheets in glass towers. They are built on the back of catastrophe. They are forged in the crucible of disaster. Edmund McIlhenny lost everything, and in doing so, he gained the world. The next time you see that little glass bottle with the diamond label, remember the ruined banker. Remember the power of a desperate pivot. And remember that sometimes the greatest fortunes are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone hungry enough to bottle them. If you want to understand the dark mechanics of historical wealth and the empires built on ruin, hit subscribe. The next dynasty